6 years. That is how long fans waited between the moment a name was whispered on screen for the first time and the moment anyone tried, even briefly, to explain where he came from. A name spoken by a hologram in a room full of people who were too afraid to ask a follow-up question. 6 years, and then the follow-up question was answered with a shrug dressed up as a plot twist. Somewhere in a fan forum, in the same week that Whisper first aired, someone typed a sentence that would echo for the better part of a decade. They're never going to tell us, and if they do, it won't be enough. That sentence was less a complaint than a prophecy. It undersold what was coming. It undersold more than anything how many other doors would swing open a crack, show a shape in the dark, and then quietly close again unlatched for years. This is a franchise built, in large part, out of unanswered questions, not gaps left by accident, the way a rushed production forgets a detail. Deliberate ones. Doors installed and never opened on purpose because a closed door is more interesting than anything you could put behind it. Tonight is about those doors, not the ones that eventually got kicked in by a sequel or a spin-off or a tie-in novel written 6 years later to patch a hole nobody remembered asking about. Those are settled questions now, filed away, footnotes. Tonight is about the ones still standing, still shut, still humming, faintly, behind the wood, in a galaxy that likes to insist it explains itself and again quietly declines to. How a franchise built on the promise of ancient ordered mythology became a house full of locked rooms nobody has the key to starts with a single word, spoken by a puppet, about a place he refused to name. In 1980, in a swamp on a soundstage in England, a small green creature told a young man that he was not ready to know, not ready to see, not ready to walk into a cave that did not, technically, need walls to be dangerous. The cave was described as strong with the dark side of the Force. Nothing else. No history. No name for what lived there. No explanation of why that particular tree, that particular hollow in the mud, had accumulated so much of something the film had spent an hour trying to define as light against dark, good against evil, and then handed the audience a place that appeared to be neither, only old and only wrong. The scene lasts under 2 minutes. It has outlived explanations 3 times its length. Because here is the dismissive judgment history handed to that swamp, that cave, that whole idea. It doesn't matter. It's a vision. It's Luke's fear made physical, a psychological test. Nothing more. Nothing that needs a source, an owner, a reason. Treat it as symbolism and move on. That was the working theory for decades, repeated so often in commentary tracks and film school essays that it calcified into something close to canon on its own, without a single frame of footage ever confirming it. A vision, just a vision, nothing to sit with. It was not just a vision. The 40-year gap between that scene and the tie-in fiction that finally started circling it, a novel here, a comic arc there, none of them landing a final answer, all of them agreeing only that something old and hungry had been present on that planet long before a young farmer ever set foot near it, says more about the storytelling instincts at the center of this galaxy than almost any single confirmed answer could. The instinct was never to explain the cave. The instinct was to let the cave explain everything else. Every subsequent shadow, every subsequent whisper about a dark side that predates the people who currently claim to speak for it, borrows its unease from those 2 unexplained minutes in the mud. The 1997 re-release added new effects to nearly every corner of that film. The cave was left alone. Nobody touched it. Nobody, it seems, wanted to be the one who finally said what it was. This is the first thing to understand about the mysteries ahead before a single name gets attached to a single unanswered question. Withheld information in this galaxy is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. A cave that never explains itself teaches an audience quietly and early. That explanation was never the promise being made. The promise was atmosphere. The promise was scale. The promise was a galaxy so large, so old, that no single trilogy, no single decade of films could reasonably be expected to walk every hallway and turn on every light. Fans spent 40 years treating that cave as a puzzle with a missing piece. It was closer to a thesis statement. Everything that follows tonight, every discarded plot thread, every character introduced with weight and never given payoff, every ancient civilization gestured at and then abandoned, descends from that cave the way a family resemblance descends through generations. same shape, same refusal, same held breath. It was not an oversight, it was the first lock, and the key was never meant to turn. A hologram flickers. A cloaked figure gives an order. The order is followed, and the order changes everything that comes after it, and the figure who gave it is never seen without a hood, never named beyond a single syllable repeated with dread, and vanishes from the story roughly as quickly as he entered it, leaving behind a body count and a mystery that would outlive the trilogy built to house it. The setup is almost too clean to be an accident. Introduce a shadow with enough command presence to order the death of a Jedi Master and the creation of a secret army. Give him exactly one scene of real dialogue, and then let the story move on as though the shadow will matter later. It did not, in any meaningful narrative sense, matter later. The man whose death he ordered was replaced in the plot by other concerns almost immediately. The army he authorized fought a war that consumed 6 hours of screen time without ever circling back to ask who, precisely, had placed the order and why a records archive as vast and supposedly comprehensive as the one maintained by the Guardians of the Peace in this galaxy would come back, when searched, entirely blank. The Jedi archives, according to records referenced within the saga itself, reported no listing for the planet where that army was built. Not a gap in the records. A planet erased from them, or, more troublingly, never entered at all, as though someone with the access and the motive to hide an entire world had done exactly that, years before anyone thought to look. A librarian, confronted with the blank space where a planet should be, offered the driest possible verdict. If it's not in the records, it doesn't exist. That line was played for a small, bitter laugh in the theatre. It has aged into something closer to a warning. Bureaucracies believe their own paperwork. That belief is exactly the kind of gap a patient conspirator would spend a decade preparing to walk through. Here is the reframe worth sitting with. It was not a plot hole, it was a demonstration. The single most consequential order given in that entire 6-film saga, the order that created the army that would become the instrument of the Jedi's destruction, was delivered by a man whose full identity the story never confirmed on screen, using a name that later fiction would attach to him only outside the films themselves in novels and reference guides published years apart, none of them fully agreeing on the mechanics of how he came to give that order, or on his authorization, or on whose interests he was actually serving in that exact moment. The hologram flickers, the order gets given, the war begins, and the man behind the hood gets folded into the background of his own galaxy-altering decision, a footnote to an event he arguably started. 2 names get attached to him in extended fiction over the following 2 decades. Neither fully closes the loop on motive, on chain of command, on why a Jedi of any real standing would have been trusted with that order in the first place, or why the records of that trust were allowed to vanish so completely. A different figure would later be credited in tie-in material as the true architect who manipulated this entire chain of events, but even that explanation arrived stitched together from sources that disagree with each other about sequencing, about awareness, about who was fooling whom. It was not a loose thread. It was a demonstration that this galaxy's largest wars can be started by a voice with no face, an order with no clean signature, and a filing system that will, when it matters most, simply have nothing on record, and that the audience will be expected to live with that, the same way the characters inside the story had to live with it for years, without complaint. But a hologram with no face is one kind of silence. A weapon built to remember everything and choosing to forget on command is another kind entirely, and that is where this trail leads next. Every institution in this galaxy that claims to hold knowledge eventually reveals, under pressure, that its knowledge has limits it never advertised. The Jedi archives are the clearest example, but not the only one, and the pattern across all of them is worth naming plainly before going further. This is a franchise where libraries lie, where memory can be edited, where records can be sealed by people with the right clearance and the right motive, and where nobody in the story treats this as unusual. It is treated as background texture. A given, the wallpaper of a galaxy that has apparently always worked this way. Consider the sheer scale of what one such archive claimed to hold, knowledge described in supplementary material as comprehensive enough to represent the accumulated understanding of thousands of years of civilization, drawn from thousands of worlds, maintained by an order whose entire self-image rested on being wise stewards of that knowledge. And into that same archive, a manipulation was inserted quietly, without detection, by an outside party that erased the existence of an entire planet from the record. If a single well-placed edit could erase a world from the wisest library in the galaxy, the obvious and deeply uncomfortable question is, how many other edits are sitting in that same archive right now, undetected, waiting for nobody to ask? The story never answers this. It cannot structurally answer this, because the moment it does, the archive stops being a symbol of fallible wisdom and becomes a simple plot device with a fixed, countable number of secrets. Its power, narratively, comes from the not knowing, from the possibility, never confirmed, never denied, that the single erasure the audience witnessed was not an isolated intrusion, but a crack in a foundation that had already, quietly, been compromised in other places by other hands, for other reasons, long before anyone thought to check. It was not a single act of sabotage. It was a demonstration that written history in this galaxy is only as trustworthy as the last person who had access to edit it, and that the guardians who relied on that history to make galaxy-altering decisions never once seemed to question whether the ground beneath their feet had been quietly, selectively hollowed out. There is a stillness worth noticing here, a kind of narrative rest stop before the next escalation. Picture the archive itself for a moment, not as a plot device, but as a place. High shelves disappearing into shadow, the low electrical hum of 1,000 data cores holding 1,000 years of quiet. Dust drifting in a shaft of pale light let in through a high window, footsteps softened by distance and by the sheer size of the room swallowing them whole. A place built to feel eternal. A place that, underneath that feeling, was already lying to everyone who walked through it. The unease of that scene has never fully worn off decades later, precisely because the lie inside it was never fully priced. The audience found out the archive could be wrong. The characters mostly never did. That asymmetry, the audience knowing more than the people on screen and still not being told enough to feel settled about it, is the exact machinery this whole essay keeps returning to, chapter after chapter, mystery after mystery. It was not resolved, it was left open on purpose, and the openness became its own kind of answer. Trust nothing that claims to be complete. The library that could be edited without detection is unsettling on its own, but a name whispered as legend, treated by nearly every character on screen as more myth than man, and never once given a face, a voice, or a confirmed fate, that unease runs even deeper, and it begins with a single line delivered almost as an aside about a Sith Lord who could supposedly cheat death itself. He is mentioned exactly once, by name, in the entirety of the theatrical saga. One sentence, delivered almost conversationally, framed as an old story a mentor tells an eager student, the kind of tale meant to seduce rather than inform. A Sith Lord, the story goes, so attuned to a certain aspect of the Force that he could influence the very building blocks of life, could, according to the telling, keep the people he cared about from dying at all. A power described in the same breath as forbidden, as unnatural, as the kind of secret every apprentice in that dark tradition supposedly wants and no master supposedly wants to share. And then, within the same scene, the storyteller reveals that the master died anyway, killed, the tale strongly implies, by his own apprentice in his sleep, too powerful to save even himself. A single sentence undoes an entire legend. It was not true that he could not be killed. It was not true that his power was absolute. It was, in the end, just a story a manipulative old man told a frightened young one, shaped precisely to produce the fear and the hunger he needed produced. That would be a tidy, self-contained moment of characterization, if the story had ever bothered to confirm any of it. It did not. The audience never sees this master's face on screen in any theatrical film, never sees the apprenticeship, never sees the death, the betrayal, the years that supposedly built toward it. Every detail arrives secondhand, filtered through the voice of a man whose entire relationship to truth by that point in the saga has been established as instrumental, true when useful, false when more useful still. Extended fiction would later attempt to fill this in, a novel bearing the master's name, laying out an origin, a philosophy, an entire secret history of manipulation stretching back decades before the films even begin. But that novel exists outside the saga proper, in a tier of storytelling the films themselves never acknowledge, and it resolves the character's philosophy far more thoroughly than it resolves the two questions that actually made him haunting in the first place. Was any part of that power real? And did his apprentice's betrayal happen the way the legend claims? Or is even that detail a later invention dressed up to sound like history because history sounds more convincing than confession? Here is the irony worth sitting with, worn a little differently than the others tonight. A story about ultimate power over death is passed down entirely through the voice of an unreliable narrator, and the saga never once steps outside that voice to check its work. The audience is asked to be afraid of a man they never see, based on a story told by someone with every reason to lie about him, and the fear works anyway, has worked for decades, precisely because it was never confirmed or denied. A confirmed lie would have been disappointing. A confirmed truth would have been merely impressive. The unconfirmed telling is the only version that could have produced the particular lingering unease that this brief scene still produces on a rewatch all these years later in a quiet room, late at night, with nothing else demanding attention. It was not a fully drawn character. It was a legend deliberately left one layer short of confirmation, and legends left one layer short of confirmation are, it turns out, the ones that last the longest. A story about a man who might have conquered death is one kind of unfinished shadow. A weapon built to end life on a scale no single mind should be able to comprehend, and never fully explained even after two of them were built and destroyed in the same handful of years, is another kind of shadow altogether, larger, colder, and in its own way even less examined by the people who lived closest to it. Somewhere near the very beginning of the very first film ever made in this galaxy, before a single lightsaber ignites, before a single Death Star appears on a horizon, a piece of narration crawls up and away into the dark, and it makes a claim that the rest of the saga would spend the next 4.5 decades quietly declining to fully honor. It calls itself a tale, an old tale, the framing suggests, already told, already fixed, already understood by whoever is telling it. Later drafts and later supplementary material would go further, framing the entire saga as though it were being read from an ancient text, an in-universe holy book of sorts, sometimes called a journal, sometimes attributed to mysterious keepers of memory and myth who supposedly recorded galactic history, the way scripture records the history of a faith. A story with an author already implies a narrator with a perspective, a bias, a reason for choosing this telling over another. And yet, across 9 numbered films and several standalone stories, the audience is never told in any confirmed on-screen way who exactly wrote this book, what they wanted from writing it, or whether the events depicted on screen are even an accurate transcription of what actually happened, as opposed to a version shaped by whoever held the pen. This sounds, at first, like an academic curiosity rather than a mystery with any real weight. It is not. Consider what changes if the entire saga is understood as a curated telling rather than a neutral record. Consider a single Jedi Master, late in the saga, instructing a former apprentice that a certain sacred text contains no version of the truth she hasn't already gathered elsewhere. A line delivered with total confidence, and never verified, never cross-checked, treated by the story as simply correct because a wise old man said it while sitting near a dying fire. If the very Jedi Order that maintained these texts for 1,000 generations could have its own archive quietly edited without detection, as already established, then the deeper texts, the mythic ones, the ones invoked with reverence rather than data, deserve exactly the same suspicion and receive almost none of it. The reframe here matters more than it first appears to. It was not a throwaway line about ancient scripture. It was an admission, buried in a moment of quiet mentorship, that even the wisest character in the saga's final act was still operating on faith rather than verification when it came to the foundational stories of his own order. If Luke Skywalker, arguably the most powerful and most reflective Jedi to appear across the entire saga, never confirmed the authorship or the accuracy of the texts he was raised to revere, then the audience was never going to be handed that confirmation either. The withholding wasn't an oversight. It was thematically consistent. A galaxy built on ancient orders that quietly lied to themselves about how much they actually knew was never going to suddenly produce a reliable narrator to explain it all from the outside. There is a stillness worth sitting in here, a small room off the main hallway of this chapter. Picture a modest, sparse dwelling on a green island at the edge of a grey sea, wind moving through old stone, a small fire throwing soft orange light against a low ceiling, and a stack of ancient, brittle-paged books sitting untouched on a shelf for years before anyone reads them again. That image, quiet, patient, slightly sad, is closer to how this mystery actually feels than any conspiracy theory built around it. Not a locked vault guarded by something monstrous. Just old books, unread, uncorrected, sitting in the dark, waiting for someone with the will to actually ask who wrote them and why, and mostly not being asked. It was not a plot hole to be patched later. It was a soft admission, repeated quietly across decades of storytelling, that even the keepers of this galaxy's deepest history were never fully sure whose voice they were actually hearing when they opened the oldest books they owned. That soft, unresolved uncertainty about who is telling the story is one kind of quiet unease. A very different, colder kind belongs to a single aged face on a giant screen, ruling from shadow, claiming power older and deeper than anyone around him could verify, and offering, across 2 full films, almost nothing about where that face and the mind behind it actually came from. He appears first as a projection, 12 feet tall, scarred, robed, speaking with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never once needed to justify himself to the people in the room. He commands loyalty from a general who fears him openly. He commands fear from a young man being groomed, quite obviously, to replace someone. And for an entire film, audiences are given exactly nothing about who he actually is. No homeworld, no lineage, no training, no name beyond the one whispered with dread, no explanation for how he came to hold the kind of power that another character later would describe as being able to raise the dead, a power previously discussed in a very different film, decades earlier, as the specific, rare, and supposedly extinguished specialty of one particular vanished Sith Lord. That echo is not incidental, and it is worth naming plainly. The specific ability attributed to this new figure of unchallenged authority is the same specific ability attributed, one trilogy earlier, to the Sith Lord, whose death was itself never confirmed on screen. 2 separate stories, separated by decades of production and years of in-universe time, both circling the exact same rare, borderline mythical power, and neither one willing to close the loop on where that power actually originated, who taught it, or whether it was ever fully lost in the first place. A pattern that repeats twice in a saga this size is rarely coincidence. It is far more often a door the storytellers keep almost opening and then, at the last possible moment, choosing to leave shut. For the length of an entire film, this figure exists purely as effect without cause. A scarred face, a golden throne room, a voice that never once raises itself because it has never needed to. The dismissive judgment offered by the story itself, delivered through the mouth of a headstrong young hero eager to prove himself, is almost embarrassingly direct, a suggestion that the whole apparatus of fear surrounding this figure is smaller and more fragile than it appears, a costume of power rather than the real thing. That judgment turns out to be catastrophically wrong, in the most literal physical sense the story can offer, in the very next act of the same film. And yet, even in being proven wrong about the fragility, the story never pays off the more basic question underneath it: fragile or not, where did any of this come from? Later material, some of it produced years afterward, in a different corner of the storytelling machine entirely, would eventually assign this figure an origin far stranger and far more mechanical than anything implied by his first unexplained appearance. A creation rather than a person in the ordinary sense, built and discarded and rebuilt across failed attempts, grown rather than born, animated by a will that was never fully his own to begin with. That answer, when it finally arrived, resolved a great deal about mechanism while resolving remarkably little about meaning, because a figure who commanded a galaxy through sheer unexplained menace for an entire film turns out retroactively to have been closer to a puppet than a mastermind, and the saga never quite finds the space to sit with what that retroactive smallness actually does to the fear he generated in the first place. The mystery was not simply who he was. The mystery, still sitting there mostly untouched, is what it means that the galaxy's most menacing, unexplained figure turned out, once explained, to explain almost nothing about the deeper design he was only ever a piece of. It was not a character left thin by accident. It was a demonstration, repeated a full trilogy after the first one, that towering, wordless menace is often scaffolding for something the story isn't ready to fully justify, and that even when the scaffolding finally gets a name attached to it, the thing underneath can remain every bit as unexplained as it was the day it first flickered onto a screen as a shadow with no history. A face with no history commanding fear from a golden throne is one kind of silence. A weapon the size of a moon, built not once but twice, in secret, by an empire whose engineering and labor logistics were never remotely accounted for on screen, is a very different scale of silence. Quieter in tone, perhaps, but almost unimaginably larger in scope. Somewhere in the vicinity of a distant, unremarkable planet, a station roughly the size of a small moon orbits in secret for years before anyone outside a small circle of officers and engineers appears to know it exists. It is armed with a weapon capable of destroying an entire planet in a single shot, a capability the story treats in its very first demonstration as an act so total it renders the destroyed world's culture, history, and population essentially retroactive footnotes mentioned once in a single line of dialogue and never dwelt upon again by anyone who might reasonably be expected to grieve it. The scale of that first act of destruction is almost impossible to sit with honestly, and the story, tellingly, does not ask its characters to sit with it either. It moves on, at pace, to the next plot beat, the way only a story confident that its audience will not ask uncomfortable follow-up questions can afford to. Here is the first uncomfortable follow-up question, offered gently. How, exactly, was something the size of a moon constructed in secret by a bureaucracy large enough to require an actual Senate, without any confirmed accounting of the labor force required, the mining operations required, the sheer industrial footprint required to build something of that scale even once, let alone build it a second time, within a matter of years after the first one is destroyed? The story gestures at forced labor in supplementary material, it gestures at specific engineers, specific contractors, in tie-in fiction released long after the films themselves. But the films, the primary text, the tale, the opening narration insists on calling itself, never once paused to explain how an empire that could not, apparently, prevent a handful of rebels from stealing its own schematics managed the far larger and far more logistically staggering task of building 2 moon-sized battle stations inside a single decade, using resources, workers, and supply chains that appear on screen, essentially nowhere. The second uncomfortable follow-up question is quieter and, in its way, sadder. What happened to the people who built it? Not the officers, not the named villains standing on the bridge issuing orders in clipped, confident voices. The others, the laborers, the technicians, the countless unnamed workers whose presence is required by the sheer physical reality of the object, but whose faces, names, and fates the story never once acknowledges, before or after either station's destruction. A structure that size does not build itself, and a structure that size does not empty itself painlessly when it explodes. The films offer, across both stations and both explosions, precisely nothing about who was inside when the moment came, beyond command staff spoken about in the same breath as strategic assets rather than people. It was not simply an omission for pacing's sake, it was, whether by design or by the accumulated silence of decades of storytelling choices, a quiet demonstration of how easily even genuinely thoughtful, well-loved stories can treat unimaginable scale as background noise, a number too large to be a person, and therefore too large to be a mystery worth solving on screen. Even though of every unanswered question in this galaxy, this may be the one with the most actual human weight sitting quietly underneath it, unexamined, twice. The stillness here is worth pausing in a little longer than usual, not because there is more to say, but because there is less, and the less deserves room rather than filling. A distant hangar bay, empty at the hour between shifts, the low hum of ventilation systems built to move air through corridors long enough to house a small city, a maintenance worker's tools left neatly stacked at the end of a shift that never had a next morning. No music in this image, no drama, just quiet and scale, and the specific kind of silence that comes from a story choosing again and again not to look directly at something it clearly knows is there. It was not resolved, and there is a real argument that it should never be resolved neatly. Some silences are more honest left as silences than dressed up with a tidy number of casualties and a tidy list of names. But the unease of it remains, unlicensed by the story's usual habit of offering meaning to nearly everything else it touches. A weapon of unimaginable, unaccounted for scale is one kind of mystery too large to hold comfortably. A single bounty hunter's quiet, near-total survival of an encounter that appeared in the moment to be unambiguously fatal is a much smaller mystery by comparison, and yet it lingered unresolved on screen for almost as long as any of the larger ones, becoming a kind of running joke among audiences before it ever became anything closer to an answer. He falls into a pit in the desert, screaming, armor and cloak disappearing into darkness, and the creature waiting at the bottom of that pit is described in the same film by another character as something whose digestive process takes roughly 1,000 years, a detail delivered almost as a grim joke, a flourish of world-building menace rather than a serious data point anyone expected to matter later. The bounty hunter in question, by every visual and narrative signal the film offers in that moment, is gone. His ship is later seen destroyed. No body is shown, but none is expected to be shown, because the fall itself, combined with the creature waiting below, reads as final in every way a story typically signals finality. He was not, it would turn out years later, decades later, in real-world time, actually gone at all. The gap between that apparent on-screen death and the eventual confirmed reappearance of this character, alive, scarred, and building a new chapter of his story from the wreckage of the old one, stretched across more than 3 decades of real-world time before it was ever meaningfully addressed. For most of those decades, the survival was treated by the broader audience less as an open question the story owed an answer to, and more as an accepted piece of extended lore, patched together informally through supplementary novels and comics that each offered their own version of the escape, none of them fully agreeing with each other, none of them confirmed by the films as the definitive account. When the answer finally did arrive on screen, it arrived compressed into a handful of quiet, almost incidental lines and a brief flashback. An escape built on quick thinking, old grudges, and sheer physical endurance, resolved with none of the fanfare that 30 years of audience curiosity might have seemed to demand. There is something worth noticing in that mismatch between decades of accumulated question and the quiet, almost shrugging sighs of the eventual answer. It suggests, gently, that not every mystery in this galaxy is being tended by a master plan waiting patiently for its moment. Some of them are simply left open because the story that created them moved on to other things, and the audience, patient, attentive, hungry for connective tissue, did the work of keeping the question alive far longer and with far more care than its original creators seemed to expect. The mystery, in other words, may have mattered more to the people asking it than to the story that first posed it, and there is something oddly comforting in that asymmetry rather than something disappointing, proof that curiosity itself can be a kind of authorship, filling in gaps a story never intended to leave open for so long, keeping a small, half-forgotten thread warm across 3 decades until someone finally, quietly picked it back up. It was not a puzzle box with a satisfying final answer waiting inside it the whole time. It was a small, human-scale gap, a fall, a scream, an assumption of death that the audience filled with imagination for far longer than the story ever asked them to, and that is, in its own modest way, one of the gentler mysteries this galaxy has to offer, proof that not every silence hides something vast, and that sometimes a silence is simply a door left ajar, waiting, without any urgency at all, for someone to eventually walk back through it. The weakness in that scene, a fall treated as an ending, staged with just enough ambiguity to be technically survivable, turned out, 30 years later, to be exactly the hidden strength that let one of this galaxy's most minor characters become one of its most quietly enduring. It was not a death, it was a door. And doors, this galaxy keeps teaching, are almost never as final as they first appear. For years, inside the story itself, a single object was treated as though it were the most valuable thing in the galaxy, a partial map, incomplete, fragmentary, pointing toward a world that had, quite deliberately, been left off every official record, every archive, every star chart maintained by the very people who most needed to find it. A resistance searched for it. A newly risen order of dark warriors searched for it with equal, perhaps greater, desperation. And the man they were all searching for had gone to considerable lengths personally to make sure the search would be difficult, traveling, according to the story's own accounting, to what was described as the very first temple built by the very first practitioners of a certain ancient tradition, a place so old that its exact founding predates almost every other timestamp offered anywhere else in the saga. And once he was found there, and once the audience finally saw the place he had chosen, the film gave remarkably little beyond atmosphere. Weathered stone huts, a grey, restless sea, circling seabirds, an old man in worn robes, sitting with his back to the door, refusing for a long moment even to turn around and acknowledge the person who had crossed the galaxy to find him. No history of the temple was offered beyond its supposed age. No explanation of how, precisely, the first of its kind came to be built in that particular place, on that particular remote island, by whoever came before the tradition had a name anyone in the present day still recognized. No account of what those first practitioners believed, beyond a handful of ancient texts that, as already discussed, nobody on screen ever confirmed as accurate. Here is the quiet, cumulative weight of that silence. An entire trilogy is set in motion, in large part, by the search for a location the story treats as sacred and foundational, and the foundation itself, what actually happened there, who actually built it, what it actually meant before it became a hiding place for one exhausted, self-exiled man, is never given more than atmosphere and implication. The temple's age is treated as self-evidently significant. Its actual history is treated as beside the point. This is not a flaw unique to this particular thread. It is, by this point in the collection, a familiar shape, the same shape as the cave in the swamp, the same shape as the archive with the missing planet, the same shape as the sacred texts nobody ever verifies. Age in this galaxy is consistently used as a substitute for explanation, as though enough centuries stacked on top of a mystery are meant to feel like an answer in themselves. It was not a location built for exposition. It was a location built for feeling, for the specific physical sensation of arriving somewhere very old, very remote, and very tired, and being asked to accept that feeling as sufficient, the way the character searching for it was ultimately asked to accept it as sufficient too, disappointment and all. There is room here to slow down and simply sit inside that place for a moment longer than the plot itself allowed. Imagine the wind first, not fierce, not dramatic, just constant, moving low across grey water that never quite settles, the kind of wind that has been blowing across that particular stretch of coastline for longer than anyone currently alive has existed to notice it. Imagine stone steps worn smooth in the middle by feet that stopped walking them decades ago, each step slightly more rounded than the one before it, a record of use with no remaining witnesses left to explain what that use once meant. Imagine the particular quality of silence found only in places built for people who valued silence above almost everything else. A silence that does not feel empty so much as attended to, tended, kept, the way a garden is tended even after the gardener has stopped expecting anyone to visit it. None of this explains the mystery. It simply sits beside it, the way a great deal of this galaxy's unanswered history seems content to be sat beside rather than solved. It was not resolved, this quiet, elemental question of what came first. Not the man who hid there, not the order he half founded and half fled, but the place itself, the temple, the stones, the reason that particular island, of all the islands in an ocean, on a planet, in a galaxy of uncountable worlds, became the one chosen, generations ago, by someone whose name nobody left behind ever remembered. An island holding its silence at the far edge of an ocean is one kind of ancient, patient mystery. A single, quiet, still unsettled question about the person who once seemed destined to inherit that whole tradition, who she came from, and whether that question was ever actually meant to matter as much as the story, for a time insisted it did, carries a very different, more personal kind of unresolved weight. For the length of nearly one entire film, a young scavenger raised on a desert world waits for family that never comes, marking days on a wall inside a fallen war machine she has made into a home, and the story surrounding her, the marketing, the speculation, the sheer weight of audience attention focused on one single unanswered question, asks, almost obsessively, who her parents were, and what that answer would mean for her place in a mythology built up to that point almost entirely around inherited bloodlines and inherited destinies. The eventual answer, delivered by the very last voice in the story anyone expected to trust with something so personal, was blunt in a way this saga rarely allows itself to be. Nobody. Filthy junk traders, sold for drinking money, already dead, buried in unmarked graves in the desert she'd spent her whole life trying to leave. a dismissal dressed up as compassion, delivered by a manipulative old man for his own manipulative reasons, and yet, and this is the detail worth sitting with, not obviously untrue in its substance, even if the messenger delivering it could not be trusted an inch. A different film, made only a few years later, reversed this answer almost entirely, revealing a bloodline stretching back to the very heart of the saga's oldest and most infamous evil, a connection the earlier film had gone out of its way to seem to foreclose, and the reversal, rather than settling the mystery, opened a second, quieter one that the story never circled back to close with the same confidence it had used to open it. Whether the earlier answer, nobody, ordinary, unremarkable, was ever meant to be understood as a lie all along, planted deliberately to mislead a young woman who was, by that point, being actively hunted by the very grandfather the later film would reveal, or whether the story itself changed its mind partway through, the way long collaborative sagas sometimes do, and asked its audience to simply accept the newer answer as though it had always been the plan. The reframe worth naming plainly here, gently, without judgment. It was never really a mystery about parentage at all, not underneath. It was a mystery about which kind of story this saga actually believed itself to be, one where anyone, regardless of bloodline, could matter as much as the people born into legacy, or one that, in the end, could not quite let go of the older, more familiar comfort of lineage as destiny. Both answers were given years apart by the same continuing story, and neither one ever fully absorbed or addressed the other, leaving a strange doubled quality to the character at the center of it. A young woman who was told, at different points in her own life, that she came from nothing, and that she came from something enormous and terrible, and who never quite got the chance, on screen, to reconcile what it meant to have been handed both of those stories in earnest by different people at different times for different reasons. It was not simply a twist reversed by a later twist. It was a question the saga itself seemed genuinely unresolved about, mirrored directly onto a character who spent her whole arc searching for the exact same kind of resolution the story surrounding her could never quite settle on either. There is something soft and worth resting in here, something closer to comfort than to further mystery. Whatever the true, final intended answer was, nobody, or the granddaughter of an emperor, or something quieter still that never made it to screen at all, the character herself, by the end of her story, chooses her family rather than simply inheriting one, takes a name that was never hers by blood and makes it hers by devotion instead. That choice does not resolve the mystery of where she came from. It simply, quietly, suggests that the question may have mattered less in the end than the story spent years insisting it did, which is itself a kind of answer, even if it is not the kind that closes a door so much as gently, deliberately leaves it open on purpose. A single life's uncertain origin is a small, human-scaled, unresolved question, even inside a galaxy this large. Further back, long before any bloodline the saga bothers to name, an entire civilization, older than the Jedi, older than the Sith, older than almost anything else given a name on screen, is gestured at across scattered ruins and half-buried artifacts, and never once given the kind of sustained attention its age alone seems to demand. Scattered across a handful of stories, some in the films themselves, more in supplementary material produced years apart by different creative teams working with only loose coordination, are the fingerprints of civilizations that predate everything the mainline saga treats as ancient. Statues carved by hands whose owners left behind no written account of themselves. Ruins buried under centuries of dust on remote, half-forgotten worlds, discovered generations later by explorers who can only guess at what they represented. A language, in at least one case, deciphered only partially, its meaning reconstructed rather than translated in any confident sense. These are not throwaway details. They are the quiet suggestion, repeated in fragments across decades of storytelling, that whatever history the audience has been told to treat as ancient, the founding of the Jedi Order, the earliest recorded Sith teachings, is itself relatively recent, a chapter beginning partway through a much longer book whose earlier pages were never included in the edition anyone actually gets to read. The story rarely states this outright. It implies it instead through the specific choice of what gets left in ruins rather than fully excavated. An explorer character investigating one such site finds evidence that the very concept later formalized as a codified philosophy of balance and discipline may have originated with people who predate the order that eventually claimed and refined it, not invented by the Jedi at all, in other words, but inherited, borrowed, and given a new name by people who arrived later and simply never advertised how much of their foundation had already been laid by hands long gone before they arrived. If true, and the story never confirms it as more than implication, this would mean that one of the saga's two great ideological pillars, the disciplined, ordered use of a mystical energy field, was built, at least in part, on the uncredited work of a civilization whose name has not survived into the present day of the story at all. This is, in its quiet way, one of the more unsettling implications tucked into this whole collection of open doors, because it suggests something the saga rarely likes to say plainly, that the ancient orders treated with such reverence throughout 9 films and countless spin-offs may themselves be relatively young. Relative to a deeper history, the story keeps circling without ever fully entering. Every time a Jedi Master speaks of 1,000 generations, every time a Sith apprentice invokes the weight of ancient tradition, the numbers being invoked are, by the logic scattered across these buried ruins, almost certainly a fraction of the actual timeline. A few well-lit centuries standing in front of a much longer, much darker hallway that the story has chosen, consistently, not to walk down. It was not a minor world-building detail, easily forgotten. It was a suggestion, repeated softly across multiple separate stories that otherwise share very little in common, that this galaxy's entire visible mythology, Jedi, Sith, Republic, Empire, all of it, may be sitting on top of a much older foundation whose true shape nobody currently alive in the story, and nobody currently watching from outside it, has ever been shown in full. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs to this chapter more than any other so far, and it deserves a moment of its own before moving on. Consider a single excavation site at dusk, wind moving low across sand that has not been disturbed by any meaningful settlement in longer than most civilizations manage to survive at all. A half-buried statue with an expression worn smooth by time rather than by any particular sculptor's original intention, and a small, portable light illuminating for a moment a single carved symbol whose meaning no living translator can confirm with total confidence. There is no danger in this image. No villain waiting in the dark. Just time, moving slowly, indifferent to whichever order currently believes itself to be the oldest and wisest thing this galaxy has ever produced. It was not resolved, and it may never be meant to be resolved, not fully. Some questions in this galaxy seem designed less to be answered than to quietly recontextualize everything else the audience thought it already understood, the way discovering an older foundation beneath a familiar house changes how every room above it feels, even though nothing in those rooms has physically moved at all. A civilization erased from memory by nothing more dramatic than the passage of time is one shape of unresolved history. A single, strange, liminal place, neither fully inside this galaxy's ordinary rules of time and space, nor fully outside them, glimpsed only once briefly by a handful of characters and never returned to with anything like the thoroughness its implications seem to demand, carries a different, stranger kind of unfinished weight, and it is there that this collection turns next, as the hour grows later and the pace from here forward begins to slow. There is a place in this galaxy's mythology that does not behave like the rest of it. Most locations, however strange, obey at least the loose rules the story has established for how time and space and cause and effect tend to work. A starship travels from one point to another. A message takes time to arrive. A death, once it happens, tends to stay finished. This place does not fully agree to any of that. It was shown only once, briefly, glimpsed through a doorway that appeared quite suddenly inside the ruins of a temple already established as ancient beyond easy reckoning, and what it revealed, in the small amount of time the story allowed anyone to look at it, was something closer to a corridor built from moments rather than distance. Doorways opening not onto other rooms, but onto other times, other places. Echoes of events already lived through once, replayed at the threshold like something between a memory and a wound that has never quite closed. A single character walked through one of those doorways and returned changed, having witnessed and, in a very careful, very limited sense, altered something that had already happened long before she was born. The story treats this ability with something close to reverence and something close to caution in equal measure. the way it tends to treat most things that touch this closely on the boundary between what has happened and what could still be made to happen differently. And then, having shown just enough to establish that a place like this exists at all, the story closes the door again, both literally and structurally, and moves on, leaving behind exactly the kind of quiet, glowing, half-answered mystery this whole collection has spent its length gathering up one careful piece at a time. The questions this place raises are not small ones, and the story's unwillingness to sit with them for longer than a handful of minutes of screen time only makes them feel larger in retrospect, the way a brief glimpse of something vast through a cracked door often does more work on the imagination than a long, well-lit tour ever could. Who built this corridor, and why, and using what understanding of the underlying nature of time that the rest of the galaxy's philosophy, built as established on the far more linear disciplines of the light side and the dark side, never otherwise references or explains. Whether other doorways like it exist elsewhere, in other ruins, on other worlds, waiting quietly for someone else to stumble through them the way this one was stumbled through, more or less by accident, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary crisis. Whether the specific limits the story places on what can and cannot be changed once someone enters that corridor are hard rules built into the fabric of the place itself, or simply the limits of what one particular character, in one particular moment, under one particular kind of pressure, happened to be capable of achieving. None of this receives a clear answer. What it receives instead, and this is worth naming as its own kind of quiet reward, is atmosphere handled with unusual care even by this saga's own high standard for atmosphere. Swirling light where walls should be, doorways stacked in impossible geometric patterns receding into a darkness that never resolves into a visible ceiling or floor. The sound design deliberately hollow and echoing in a way that suggests distance without ever confirming what exactly that distance is measured across. It is, of every mystery gathered here tonight, the one that feels least like an oversight and most like a door the storytellers built specifically to be beautiful rather than explained. A place designed, quite deliberately it seems, to generate wonder precisely by refusing to be fully mapped. It was not a plot mechanism left incomplete by accident. It was a demonstration, gentler and stranger than most of the others in this collection, that some places in this galaxy are built entirely out of the specific private ache of unfinished business. Grief revisited, choices reconsidered, the small human wish that a single terrible moment could somehow be walked back into and softened, if only slightly, if only once. And that a story confident enough in its own mythology can sometimes choose to let a place like that remain gorgeous and unexplained rather than folding it neatly into the mechanics of everything else. There is room here to slow all the way down, the way the story itself slowed down in the handful of minutes it spent inside this place before closing the door on it again. Picture light without a visible source, moving the way water moves rather than the way light usually moves, cool against the skin without any warmth to explain its glow. Picture a corridor of doorways stretching in every direction at once, familiar shapes glimpsed through some of them, and utterly unfamiliar shapes glimpsed through others, none of them offering more than a few seconds worth of understanding before the geometry shifts and a different doorway takes their place. Picture the specific, quiet vertigo of standing somewhere that does not care in any observable way about the ordinary human need to know where one is, or when one is, or whether the ground beneath one's feet is really ground at all in any sense that matters. This is not a frightening image, in the end, though it easily could have been. It reads instead as something closer to peace found at the exact center of total disorientation, the particular rare calm of a place too strange to be afraid of in any ordinary way. It was not resolved, and there is a strong argument, gentler than most of the arguments made across this whole collection, that it was never meant to be. A door glimpsed once, briefly and never fully explained, may simply be doing exactly the work it was built to do, reminding a very large, very old, very self-assured mythology that even it does not yet know everything about its own rules, and that some rooms are more valuable, in the end, for the wonder of having been glimpsed at all than for anything a full explanation could ever add to them. A doorway between moments, glimpsed once and left mostly unexplained, is one kind of gentle, wondering mystery. A small, green, quietly powerful creature raised in secret by a single order for reasons never once stated on screen. A creature whose entire species remains, decades after first appearing, functionally unnamed and functionally unexplained, carries a very different kind of unresolved question, smaller in scale, but in its own soft way, no less persistent. He appears first in a swamp, barely 3 feet tall, testing a young man's patience and character before revealing, gradually, unmistakably, that the small, strange creature standing in front of him is in fact one of the most respected and powerful teachers the galaxy's oldest order of peacekeepers has ever produced. And from the very first frame in which he appears, one detail is treated as simply, permanently unknowable, folded into the story's fabric with such total confidence that most audiences, for decades, never even thought to question it directly. What species is he? Where does that species come from, and why? Across 9 numbered films and countless hours of surrounding material, has that single detail never once been given a clear, on-screen answer? The absence is almost startling once it is actually noticed. Nearly every other species that recurs meaningfully across this saga is given, eventually, at least a passing account of origin. A homeworld named, a culture sketched, a handful of defining traits established even for background characters glimpsed for only a few seconds of screen time. This one character, arguably the single most beloved and most narratively central non-human figure in the entire saga's history, receives none of that. No named homeworld, no named culture, no explanation for the unusually long lifespan his species appears to enjoy, nor for the specific, pronounced sensitivity to the underlying energy field that seems to run through nearly every member of it the story ever bothers to introduce. He simply exists, fully formed, fully wise, fully mysterious, exactly as he first appeared in that swamp, and the story has never once felt the need to walk that mystery back. A second creature of the same unnamed species eventually appears, generations earlier in the story's internal timeline, offering the audience its first real glimpse of what this species might look like when young rather than ancient. And even then, even with 2 examples now available for comparison, the story declines the opportunity to fill in the gap any further. If anything, the second appearance deepens the mystery rather than resolving it by confirming that whatever this species is, its members can apparently serve at the very highest levels of the galaxy's most powerful order of peacekeepers across multiple, widely separated eras without that order itself, an institution obsessed in nearly every other context with genealogy, training records, and formal documentation, ever once producing so much as a name for the world these 2 individuals came from. Decades later, a third example finally arrives, a small green child, discovered alone, hunted by remnants of a fallen empire for reasons that are themselves only partially explained, raised for a time by a bounty hunter who comes to care for him more than either of them initially expects. And even this newest addition to the pattern, given far more screen time across a serialized story than either of his predecessors ever received across the entire theatrical saga combined, still withholds the one detail that would, at long last, close this particular chapter for good: the name of the species itself, the name of the world it calls home, the reason its numbers appear to be so vanishingly small that 3 examples, spread across nearly a full century of the story's internal chronology, represent nearly the entire visible population the audience has ever been shown. It was not an oversight sustained by simple neglect. It was, across 3 separate decades of storytelling produced by different teams working with different tools for different audiences, a consistent, almost stubborn choice to let this specific absence remain exactly as it was on the day it was first introduced. Proof that some mysteries persist, not because nobody thought to solve them, but because the not knowing was itself quietly recognized as part of what made the character work in the first place. A wise old creature whose species and homeworld are never named carries a specific kind of weightless, ageless quality that a fully explained one would almost certainly lose. The absence, in other words, may not be a gap at all. It may be load-bearing. There is a soft, slow image worth resting in here, gentler than almost anything else offered across this whole collection so far. A small figure, alone, wrapped in worn brown robes, sitting cross-legged in near-total stillness on a fallen log somewhere deep in a swamp that has never once needed to be explained beyond its own quiet, damp, softly glowing atmosphere. A place content the way its most famous resident is content to simply exist without offering an account of itself to anyone passing through. There is no danger in this image. There is barely even a question in it by the time the mind settles into it fully. There is only a small green shape, ancient beyond easy reckoning, at peace in a place that has never once needed a name to feel completely, entirely real. It was not resolved. and by this point in the night it barely needs to be. Some doors are worth leaving closed simply because of how gently, how completely, the not knowing has settled into something closer to comfort than curiosity. A small, unnamed species raised in quiet mystery is a soft kind of unanswered question, warm rather than unsettling. A single young man's fall from grace, and the very specific, very personal question of what exactly remained of him underneath everything he became, and what, if anything, survived that fall long enough to matter once the fall was finally fully over on Mesham, carries a heavier kind of unresolved weight, and it is there gently, unhurriedly, that this collection turns next. A young man is promised greatness by an old man who needs him broken in order to use him, and across the span of one trilogy he breaks exactly as thoroughly as that old man intended, trading a name, a face, and eventually nearly everything recognizable about himself for power he is told again and again will let him prevent the very losses that most terrify him. He does not prevent them. He causes them instead more completely and more permanently than almost anyone else in the story ever manages to cause anything, and by the time the story is finished with him, decades later, in a different trilogy entirely, the audience is asked to believe that some quiet, buried part of the man he once was survived all of it, intact enough, somewhere far beneath the mask and the armor and the years of practiced cruelty to be called back one final time, at the very end, by the memory of who he used to be before any of it began. Whether that survival is fully earned by everything the story shows in between is one of the oldest and most persistently argued, unresolved questions this saga has ever produced, and it remains genuinely, honestly unresolved, not because the story refuses to take a position, but because the position it does take arrives compressed into a small handful of scenes near the very end of an extremely long story, asking a great deal of trust from an audience that spent years watching this same man commit acts the story itself never once tries to minimize or excuse. A single line of dialogue, delivered gently, using a name the character had not been called by anyone in decades, is treated as sufficient to unlock whatever remained of the man underneath the mask. Whether that is a triumphant, hard-won moment of grace or a slightly too tidy resolution to a fall that took an entire trilogy to complete and only a scene or two to reverse, remains a question this saga poses honestly and answers only partially, leaving the door once again very deliberately ajar. The second version of this same character's story, appearing a full generation later in a different trilogy, complicates the question rather than resolving it. This time, the fall happens faster. The reasons are murkier, filtered through manipulation, inherited trauma, and the deliberate machinations of a grandfather he barely understood he had. And the redemption, when it finally arrives, is even more compressed than the first, occupying a matter of minutes near the very end of the character's story, before an ending that offers him peace without offering him very much time to actually live inside that peace at all. The story closes his eyes gently in the arms of someone who loves him, in a place quiet enough to feel almost like the swamp, almost like the island, almost like every other soft, unresolved, ancient corner this collection has already visited, and it declines, quite deliberately, to say very much at all about where exactly a redeemed soul like his is understood to go, within this galaxy's own vague, largely unexplained cosmology of what happens to the dead who die at peace rather than in defeat. This is perhaps the gentlest and also the largest of every mystery gathered here tonight because it sits directly underneath almost everything else this collection has already touched. A saga built around an energy field that supposedly binds all living things together, that supposedly allows certain especially attuned individuals to persist in some form after death as translucent, glowing presences capable of speaking gently to the living they once knew. And yet the story has never once fully explained the mechanism, the selection criteria, or the actual experience of that persistence from the perspective of the person persisting. Some die and vanish entirely, as bodies and as presences both. Some die and reappear, faintly glowing, offering brief counsel before fading again. The rules governing which fate belongs to whom are gestured at occasionally through lines about training, about acceptance, about a specific technique passed down through only a handful of teachers across the entire saga's timeline, but never fully laid out, never fully confirmed, left instead as one more soft, ancient, deliberately unfinished corner of a mythology that has spent 9 films and dozens of surrounding stories, consistently choosing atmosphere over explanation, wonder over certainty, the quiet hum of an old question over the crisp finality of an answer. It was not a story that forgot to explain what happens after death. It was a story that seemed to understand, instinctively, all the way back to that very first unexplained cave in that very first swamp, that some doors are more valuable left standing than opened, that a franchise which explained everything would very quickly stop feeling like a galaxy at all and would start, instead, to feel like a manual. There is a very slow, very gentle image worth closing this chapter on, quieter than almost anything offered so far tonight. A pair of twin suns setting together over a flat, empty horizon, the sky moving slowly through orange and violet, and finally into a deep, settled blue. A lone figure standing very still, watching, the way a specific young farmer once stood and watched the exact same sunset decades earlier, at the very beginning of everything this galaxy would eventually become. The sunset does not explain anything. It never has. It has simply, patiently, across nearly 50 years of real-world time, given audiences a place to rest their eyes and their questions both, together for a few quiet seconds before the story moves on to whatever comes next. It was not resolved, and by now this deep into the night that no longer feels like something worth minding very much at all. At some point, long before any story the audience has actually been shown on screen, a single teacher looked at a long tradition of dark, ambitious apprentices repeatedly turning on their masters, killing them for power, only to be killed in turn by apprentices of their own, and decided that the entire cycle could be solved with a simple arithmetic constraint. From that point forward, there would only ever be 2. One master to embody power, one apprentice to crave it. No more, no fewer, forever. An unbroken chain stretching quietly backward and forward through generations, hidden from the wider galaxy for 1,000 years with a discipline the story treats as almost impossibly successful, given how thoroughly it kept an entire tradition invisible to the very Jedi Order whose entire purpose was to watch for exactly this kind of threat. The story never shows the moment this rule was created, never shows the teacher who created it beyond a single name mentioned in passing supplementary material, never fully dramatized on screen, never explains what, precisely about limiting a tradition to exactly 2 people at a time, actually solved the underlying problem of ambition and betrayal that had caused the chaos in the first place, rather than simply making that same chaos quieter, more patient, and more effective at hiding itself for 1,000 years instead of 100. If anything, the rule as eventually shown in practice appears to encourage exactly the betrayal it was ostensibly designed to prevent, given that nearly every master-apprentice relationship the story actually depicts on screen ends, eventually, with one killing the other. The rule producing, faithfully, generation after generation, precisely the pattern it was supposedly created to interrupt. This is worth sitting with as its own quiet irony, distinct from most of the others gathered across this collection, a foundational law treated with total reverence by every character who invokes it, that appears upon close and patient examination to have solved nothing at all about the actual problem it claims credit for solving, and instead simply rebranded an old, violent cycle as a disciplined tradition, giving it a name and a number, and in doing so making it sound far more controlled and far more intentional than the pattern it actually produces, generation after generation, ever really was. The story never says this outright. It simply shows the pattern repeating calmly, without comment, trusting the audience to eventually notice the gap between the rule's stated purpose and its actual observed results. There is a slow, particular stillness that belongs to thinking about 1,000 years of hidden history all at once, the way a single held breath can sometimes stretch to cover an enormous span of unseen time. 1,000 years of masters and apprentices hidden in shadow, moving quietly between worlds, teaching in secret, dying in secret, replaced in secret. An entire parallel history running alongside the one the wider galaxy believed itself to understand, and almost none of it ever shown, ever named, ever given more than the barest gesture toward its shape. Somewhere in that unseen chain, a teacher taught the man who would eventually train the figure who ruled an empire, and somewhere further back still, further than the story has ever bothered to reach even in its supplementary corners, someone taught the very first master under this very first rule, for reasons the story has never once tried to fully explain, drawing this whole chapter gently back toward the same old, worn, comfortable observation this entire collection keeps circling without ever quite exhausting it. That age in this galaxy is so often used as a stand-in for meaning, 1,000 years invoked like a number large enough that nobody in the audience is expected to ask what precisely filled up all that time. It was not a rule that solved a problem. It was a demonstration, patient and quiet, and stretched across an entire unseen millennium, that naming a cycle and numbering its participants can feel, to the people inside it, remarkably like control, even when the actual pattern of violence underneath remains exactly precisely the same as it always was. A hidden rule stretching back 1,000 years, producing the same quiet betrayal generation after generation, is one kind of long, patient mystery. A single hidden world chosen specifically for its remoteness, its inhospitable conditions, and its complete absence from every star chart maintained by every government the story ever shows on screen, carries a very different, more physical kind of unanswered question. How precisely does an entire civilization hide itself indefinitely from a galaxy otherwise full of scanners, satellites, and centuries of careful cartography? Deep in a part of the galaxy the story describes more than once, using language usually reserved for legend rather than geography, a region so remote, so difficult to navigate, so thoroughly avoided by ordinary travelers that entire generations of pilots and cartographers came to treat it as effectively mythical rather than simply distant, sits a world capable of hosting an entire fleet, an entire hidden government, an entire resurrected figure once believed dead for decades, all without appearing on a single star chart maintained by any of the galaxy's major powers across that same span of decades. The story offers, as explanation, mostly atmosphere, strange storms, disorienting navigational hazards, a general sense that this is simply a place ordinary calculations refuse to reach. It offers very little about the actual mechanism, what precisely makes a world invisible to sensor technology sophisticated enough elsewhere in the same story to track individual ships across an entire galaxy in a matter of hours. The dismissive judgment offered early by more than one character confronted with rumors of this hidden world's existence follows the same shape nearly every dismissive judgment in this collection has followed. It's a myth, a fairy tale told to frighten children, propaganda from a bygone era with no actual bearing on present reality. And, as with nearly every other dismissal gathered across this whole collection, the judgment turns out to be catastrophically, dangerously wrong. The myth was real the entire time, hidden not by magic exactly, though the story gestures in that general direction more than once, but by a specific, deliberate combination of remoteness and disinformation maintained, apparently across multiple decades, by people with both the resources and the patience to keep an entire secret government fed, supplied, and functional without ever once slipping into visibility. The uncomfortable, still unresolved question underneath this one, much like the question underneath the twin moon-sized battle stations discussed earlier in this collection, is almost entirely about logistics rather than mysticism. Who supplied this hidden world for decades? Where did the raw materials for an entire secret fleet actually originate? How did that supply chain move undetected through a galaxy otherwise crowded with commercial shipping routes, customs checkpoints, and eventually an active and increasingly suspicious resistance movement actively hunting for exactly this kind of hidden operation? The story gestures at answers scattered across supplementary material, a network of loyal remnants, a scattering of hidden shipyards, decades of patient, quiet preparation. But the films themselves, the primary text, decline to walk the audience through any of it in detail, offering instead the same trusted device this collection has already named more than once. Scale treated as its own explanation, size and secrecy substituted for the specific mechanical account of how exactly either was actually maintained. There is room here, near the end of this particular thread, for one more slow settling image before moving on. A fleet of dark ships, hundreds of them, arranged in silent, disciplined rows across a black, storm-wrapped sky, running lights dimmed nearly to nothing, waiting patiently the way an entire hidden civilization apparently learned to wait across several decades of total secrecy for a signal that might never come, and then eventually did. There is no way to make that image feel entirely restful. It carries, even at its quietest, an undertone of dread that belongs to it honestly, the specific dread of a very large, very patient threat gathering itself in the dark, unseen, for far longer than anyone comfortable enough to be looking elsewhere had any reason to expect. And yet, even that dread, this deep into the night, settles rather than sharpens, the way most of this collection's larger fears eventually do once they have been sat with long enough, examined gently enough, allowed simply to exist without demanding a fuller answer than the story ever actually intends to give. It was not resolved in mechanical detail, and it may never fully need to be. Some hiding places work best, narratively and otherwise, precisely because the audience is never shown exactly how the trick was managed, only that it was managed patiently in the dark for far longer than anyone watching from the light ever suspected. A hidden world sustaining an entire fleet in total secrecy is one final large physical mystery, the kind built from scale and logistics rather than mysticism. But underneath nearly every mystery this collection has gathered tonight, the caves, the archives, the ancient temples, the unnamed species, the rule that solved nothing, the world that stayed hidden, sits one single, quieter, more fundamental, unresolved question. The one this whole night has been circling from its very first sentence onward, and it is there, gently, unhurriedly, that this collection turns for its final chapter. Strip away every individual mystery gathered across this long, slow collection. The swamp cave, the faceless order, the edited archive, the master who cheated death, the sacred book with no confirmed author, the scarred face with no history, the moon built twice, the bounty hunter who should not have survived, the island at the edge of the sea, the girl told she was nobody, the civilization before the names, the corridor between moments, the small green mystery raised in secret, the mask that came off too late to matter or exactly in time, the rule that solved nothing, the world that stayed hidden, and one single question sits underneath all of them, patient, quiet, older than any single mystery built on top of it. What actually is this energy field that the entire saga is built around? This force that binds, that flows, that grants power to the disciplined and the desperate alike? And why has this galaxy's storytelling, across nearly 50 years of real-world time, consistently chosen to describe its effects in loving, exhaustive detail while leaving its actual nature almost entirely undefined? The story offers metaphors generously across every era of its telling, an energy field created by all living things, surrounding, penetrating, binding the galaxy together, a description offered early, gently, by a teacher to a skeptical student, poetic rather than technical, and never meaningfully replaced by anything more technical in the decades that followed, despite one notable, deeply unpopular attempt, decades later, to ground it instead in a measurable biological cause, an attempt the story itself would eventually seem to quietly, gently walk back toward mystery rather than mechanism. The Force is light and dark, the story says, though it is also elsewhere described by other voices as neither, as something that simply is, indifferent to the labels people attach to how they use it. It is described as a single unified thing, and also in at least one memorable vision offered to a very young, very old soul in the middle of an ancient, unexplained tree as something closer to three distinct forces held in careful, uneasy balance. A description offered once in a single episode of animated storytelling and never fully integrated into or reconciled with the singular, unified description offered everywhere else across the wider saga. This is, perhaps, the gentlest way to close a collection built entirely from unanswered questions, by admitting plainly that the very energy holding the whole galaxy together, narratively, thematically, mystically, has never itself been fully defined, and that this absence of definition is very likely not a failure of the storytelling at all, but its actual quiet, patient purpose. A fully defined force would be a physics equation. An undefined one is a faith, and faiths, unlike equations, are built to be lived inside rather than solved, tended rather than completed, returned to again and again across generations of both characters and audiences without ever quite exhausting what they might still mean. It was not a story that failed to explain its own central concept. It was a story that understood, from its very first unexplained cave onward, that the central concept was never meant to be explained at all, only felt, only carried, only passed quietly from one generation of storytellers and listeners to the next, the way any old, patient, deeply held belief is passed down, incompletely, imperfectly, and somehow precisely because of that incompleteness, more durable than a fuller explanation could have ever managed to be. Deep within a story, often treated as a side road rather than a main highway of this saga's larger mythology, a witch ruled a small, secretive coven on a swamp-covered world far from the attention of either the Jedi or the Republic they served, practicing a form of the Force so different from either the ordered discipline of one tradition or the ambitious hunger of the other that the story never bothers to fully classify it as either. She raised a son through methods the story only ever gestures toward: clay, blood, and an old ritual magic never explained in mechanism, only in outcome. And when that son eventually turned against the very order that trained him, cutting himself free of 2 legs and half a decade of purpose in a single violent afternoon, it was this same witch, years later, who found him half mad and living in the wreckage of a junk world, and rebuilt him, quite literally, with new limbs of scavenged metal, so that his long, strange survival could continue. Her own death, when it finally arrived, was staged with a specific kind of ambiguity this collection has, by now, learned to recognize immediately. Struck down mid-ritual by an old enemy, her body left motionless, her magic seemingly spent, and no confirmation offered, then or since, of whether a woman whose entire practice was built around bending the usual rules governing life, death, and resurrection was actually, finally, permanently gone, or whether her death was simply another ritual, staged and endured rather than suffered, the way so much of her life already appeared to have been staged and endured rather than simply lived. The story never revisits her again directly. It leaves her exactly where she fell, in the same quiet, unresolved way it leaves nearly everything else this collection has spent its long night gathering. What makes this particular absence sting a little more than some of the others is the specific, personal shape of the magic she practiced, so distinct from everything the wider saga otherwise offers. Ordinary Force use throughout most of this galaxy's storytelling is described in the familiar language already discussed at length tonight: light and dark, calm and passion, discipline and hunger. Her practice used none of that vocabulary. It spoke instead of ancient magics, ritual sisterhoods, blood and clay, and old songs sung in a language the story never subtitles, suggesting an entire separate tributary of this galaxy's central mythology running alongside the main channel, touching it only occasionally, borrowing power from the same underlying source, but shaping it into something the Jedi and the Sith alike would likely have found unrecognizable. And having shown just enough of that tributary to make its existence undeniable, the story, once again, simply lets it run out of frame, unexplained, its source and its true extent left entirely to implication. There is a slow, cool image worth resting in here. A ring of standing stones half swallowed by swamp water, moss climbing the carved symbols along their sides, faint green light flickering from somewhere just out of frame, and a low, wordless chant carried on damp night air by voices that stopped singing it in any documented on-screen sense a very long time ago. Whether that chant is still being sung somewhere by someone in some corner of the galaxy this collection has not yet visited is exactly the kind of open, patient question this whole night has learned to hold gently rather than press for an answer to. It was not a story that forgot its witches. It was a story that let them practice their craft just long enough to be unforgettable, and then, faithful to everything else gathered here tonight, let the specifics of that craft slip quietly back into the dark where it apparently preferred to live all along. A witch whose true fate was never confirmed is one kind of old, quiet, magic-shaped mystery. A far larger and far more troubling one belongs to a single dying old man on a throne, and the plan he apparently prepared, in total secrecy, to destroy the very galaxy he had spent his whole life conquering, should that galaxy ever slip fully from his grasp. Near the very end of one particular chapter of this saga's storytelling, in the immediate aftermath of the fall of an empire, many characters believed, for a brief and cautiously hopeful moment, to be finally, truly over. A very different story reveals that the fallen ruler had, quite some time earlier, quietly prepared an entirely separate plan, held in reserve, meant to be triggered specifically in the event of his own death. A coordinated campaign of orbital bombardment and calculated ecological devastation aimed not at any specific military target, but at the wider galaxy's own capacity to recover, to rebuild, to move on without him. A scorched earth inheritance, in other words, prepared by a man who appears to have decided, at some point never shown on screen, that if he could not rule the galaxy himself, he preferred that no one else be allowed to either. The story that reveals this plan treats it as chilling, largely through implication rather than through any sustained exploration of when precisely this decision was made, or what it reveals about a ruler whose earlier ambitions, at least as described elsewhere across this collection, seem to center on eternal personal power rather than total destruction for its own sake. A man who wanted to cheat death, who wanted an empire to rule indefinitely, who reportedly explored rituals and dark, forbidden techniques specifically aimed at extending his own life well past its natural limit, apparently also, quietly, prepared the opposite contingency: total ruin rather than eternal rule. And the story never fully reconciles those two apparently competing desires into a single coherent portrait of what this man actually wanted underneath everything else in the final accounting. The uncomfortable, still open question worth sitting with here is not merely tactical. How many worlds were actually targeted? How much of the plan was carried out before it was stopped? How close the wider galaxy actually came to the kind of prolonged ecological catastrophe the plan seems to have been designed to produce? It is more personal than that, and considerably harder to settle, whether a ruler capable of preparing this kind of total, spiteful contingency ever actually believed in the empire he built, in any sense beyond its usefulness to his own continued survival, or whether the entire decades-long project of conquest the audience watched unfold across so much of this saga was, from very near its beginning, always secretly conditional on his own personal permanence. A gift he was fully prepared to take back, entirely, the moment it looked like it might no longer be his to give. The dismissive judgment offered by more than one character upon first learning of this plan follows a shape by now thoroughly familiar across this whole collection. Surely an old, defeated man's final threat is mostly bluster, mostly theatre, unlikely to have been prepared with the same patient, decades-long thoroughness as everything else this same man is shown elsewhere, preparing in total secrecy. That judgment is not fully disproven on screen exactly, but neither is it fully put to rest. The plan is stopped partially at considerable cost, and the full scope of what might have happened had it gone entirely unchecked is left deliberately to the audience's own quiet, unsettled imagination. There is a slow, heavy stillness worth sitting in here rather than rushing past. Picture a control room lit only by the pale blue glow of tactical displays, a single hand resting on a lever prepared, apparently, years in advance. For a moment, its owner always understood might someday come, and, somewhere far below, worlds going on with their ordinary business. A market opening, a child asleep, a farmer checking weather instruments before dawn, entirely unaware that their continued existence had, at some point, quietly become conditional on the personal survival of a man none of them had ever met. It was not a plan the story ever fully explained. It was a demonstration, colder than almost anything else offered across this whole collection, that even total decades-spanning power can apparently coexist in one single mind with a willingness to burn the entire achievement down, rather than let anyone else inherit it, and that the story chose in the end to let the full shape of that willingness remain mostly implied, mostly unconfirmed, rather than dramatized in the kind of full, sustained detail its implications genuinely deserve. A dying ruler's hidden contingency for total ruin is one of the coldest, largest mysteries gathered across this whole collection. A far older and, in its way, far gentler one belongs to the very oldest tombs this galaxy has ever shown on screen. The resting places of Sith Lords so ancient that even the Sith who came after them treated their names with a kind of reverent uncertainty, unsure exactly how much of what they had inherited from that deep, dark past was accurate history and how much was simply legend, retold so many times it had worn smooth into something resembling fact. On a dry, wind-swept world lined with the carved tombs of ancient Sith lords, a young apprentice once wandered alone among monuments to warriors and sorcerers whose names had, by his own era, become more legend than history, names invoked with reverence by a tradition that, by that point, had already spent 1,000 years reduced to exactly 2 practitioners at a time, hiding from a galaxy that believed their entire order long extinct. These tombs, the story implies without ever fully confirming, predate even the earliest coherent version of the tradition eventually formalized under the Rule of Two, suggesting a much older, much less disciplined era of dark side practice, sprawling and chaotic and populated by far more than a tidy handful of masters and apprentices at any given time. An era the story gestures toward through architecture and atmosphere far more than through any sustained account of what that older, wilder version of the tradition actually believed, or how, precisely, it eventually narrowed itself down into the far more controlled and far more secretive shape the more familiar tradition would later take. The reframe worth sitting with here, echoing a shape this collection has now circled several times over the course of the night, is that nearly every ancient institution this saga bothers to show on screen turns out, on close inspection, to be a compressed, tidied version of something older, messier, and far less coherent than its own later mythology prefers to admit. The Jedi Order likely inherited more from civilizations that came before it than it ever fully credited. The Sith tradition, similarly, appears to have started as something far more sprawling and far less disciplined than the tidy numbered rule its later practitioners would come to treat as ancient and unbroken. Both traditions, in other words, appear to have engaged in a quiet, ongoing project of narrative tidying, smoothing their own histories into something cleaner and older sounding than the messier reality likely was, the same way any old institution, in any story, tends to remember its own founding as more deliberate and more coherent than it probably actually felt while it was happening. There is a final slow image worth resting in before this chapter, and this whole long collection finally turns toward its close. Wind moving low across dry, cracked ground the colour of rust and old blood, carved stone faces staring out from tomb entrances, long since stripped of whatever treasures or knowledge they once protected, and somewhere at the centre of it all a single dark temple, older than anything else on the entire planet. Its true age and its true first builder never named by anyone in the story who might have once known. Whoever raised that first temple, on that first dry world, with whatever earliest, wildest version of dark side practice they were still inventing as they went, has been gone long enough now that even legend has mostly forgotten to ask about them directly, content instead to simply walk among their tombs, feel the old, patient weight of everything unexplained sitting quietly in the dust, and move on the way this entire long night has patiently, chapter after chapter, learned to do. It was not an order with a clean, single origin point after all. It was, like nearly everything else gathered across this collection, an old, sprawling, unfinished thing, tidied over centuries into something that merely sounded finished. And the tombs, still standing, still mostly unexplained, are the last quiet proof of everything the tidying left out. Every lightsaber in this saga, without exception, is built around a small, faceted stone that the story treats, from its very first mention onward, as something closer to a living participant in its own use than a simple component to be mined, cut, and installed. A Jedi, according to the tradition the story sketches only in fragments, does not merely select a crystal the way a technician selects a part. The crystal is described more than once as calling to the person meant to carry it, resonating specifically with one individual rather than another, sometimes described as needing to be earned through trial rather than simply found through search. And having established repeatedly across decades of storytelling that these crystals are meant to be understood as something more than inert matter, the saga has never once offered a clear account of what precisely they actually are. Geological in origin, the story suggests through occasional references to mining operations on distant worlds, and yet also somehow apparently capable of something close to preference, close to memory, close to a will of their own that a purely geological explanation would never predict. The clearest glimpse the story offers into what might actually be happening inside one of these crystals comes not from any Jedi teaching, but from the opposite tradition entirely, a dark side practitioner deliberately corrupting a crystal through what the story describes only as pain and dominance, bleeding the stone from its natural, clear or colored state into the harsh red more commonly associated with the Sith, that a crystal can apparently be tortured into a different state, can apparently suffer in some sense specific enough to leave a lasting, visible mark on its structure, raises questions about the nature of these small stones that the story has never once paused to answer directly. Are they, in some limited, unfamiliar sense, alive? Do they retain some fragment of awareness, some capacity for preference or resistance that would make the act of bleeding one closer to an act of violence than an act of chemistry? The story lets the imagery answer for it. A crystal audibly, almost mournfully, resisting corruption in more than one depicted scene, without ever committing to a firm, spoken position on what that resistance actually means about the true nature of the object producing it. There is a slow, careful image worth sitting inside here, quieter than almost anything else this collection has offered so far. A small, clear stone held up to a single shaft of pale light in an otherwise dark cave, turning slowly in an open palm, catching and releasing color the way a stone genuinely should not be able to do if it were only ever the simple mineral its geological origin suggests. Somewhere in that small, quiet turning is the entire unresolved question of this chapter, held gently, without pressure, the way this whole collection has learned gradually to hold nearly everything it has gathered tonight. It was not a piece of technology in any ordinary sense, whatever its geological origin might technically suggest. It was, and remains, one of this galaxy's smallest and most intimate unanswered questions. A stone that chooses, that can apparently suffer, that carries, in its own quiet, faceted way, exactly the same kind of ancient, unexplained aliveness this entire mythology has spent decades attributing to caves and temples and ancient trees and entire worlds it has never once required its audience to fully understand. A crystal capable of quiet private preference is one of the smallest mysteries gathered across this whole long night. A single teacher standing just outside the frame of nearly everything this collection has already discussed. The man who apparently first showed a frightened, ambitious young senator how to bend an entire democratic government toward its own quiet, patient collapse, remains even now almost entirely unnamed and unexplained on screen, despite being, in a very real sense, the hidden root from which nearly every other mystery in this whole collection eventually grew. Somewhere before any story the audience has actually been shown, a young man with unusual gifts and an unusually patient, unusually cold ambition was taught by someone how to hide his true nature from an order specifically trained to detect exactly that kind of hidden darkness. The story confirms this teaching happened. It confirms eventually, decades after first raising the question, one name commonly associated with that early teaching in supplementary material, produced far outside the films themselves. But within the primary saga, the 9 numbered films, the actual tale the opening narration of the very first one calls itself, the identity of this earliest teacher is never confirmed on screen, never dramatized, never given so much as a single line of dialogue in which the student in question actually names or credits the person who first showed him how to become the quiet, patient architect of an empire's rise. This absence matters more than it might first appear to, because nearly every other mystery gathered across this entire long collection eventually traces backward, at least in part, to the decisions and manipulations of this single man, the faceless order that authorized the creation of an army, the archive quietly edited to erase a planet from its own records, the scarred, unexplained figure who eventually replaced him on a golden throne, even the ancient rule of two that first taught him how to hide his tradition from a galaxy convinced it no longer existed. If this collection has a hidden architect running underneath nearly all of it, it is this one man and the specific mystery of who first showed him how to become that architect, who taught the teacher, in other words, before the teacher had any students of his own, remains even now one of the least examined gaps in the entire saga, despite the outsized weight everything traced back to it actually carries. The dismissive judgment offered by nearly every character who ever crosses paths with this man, across every era of the story in which he appears, follows the exact shape this whole collection has now traced more times than can easily be counted. He is dismissed, again and again, as a mild bureaucrat, a harmless administrator, a quiet, unthreatening presence easily overlooked by people with far more obvious concerns occupying their attention. That dismissal, more thoroughly and more catastrophically than almost any other gathered across this entire night, turns out to be wrong. Not eventually, not after some later reveal, but immediately, completely, and with consequences that reshape the entire remaining shape of the saga. And yet, even having shown so thoroughly exactly how wrong that early dismissal was, the story never circles back to show the audience the earlier moment that made the dismissal possible in the first place. The training, the teaching, the first quiet lesson in patience and concealment that turned an ambitious young man into the single most successful hidden manipulator this galaxy's entire recorded history appears to have ever produced. There is a final slow image worth sitting in before this particular thread closes, a dim, private study somewhere on a crowded, glittering city world, shelves lined with old, rarely consulted texts, a single lamp throwing warm light across a desk where two figures once sat, quietly, patiently, for far longer than anyone watching from outside that room could have possibly suspected mattered at all. Whoever sat across that desk from a young, ambitious senator, teaching him slowly, carefully, everything he would eventually need to bend an entire galaxy toward his own quiet design, left behind no name the primary story ever confirmed, no face the primary story ever showed, and no account of what, precisely, that teacher wanted for himself once his own student's education was finally, quietly, complete. It was not a minor omission tucked away in the corner of an otherwise thoroughly explained villain's origin. It was, in its own patient, unassuming way, one of the largest unanswered doors this entire collection has gathered tonight, hiding in plain sight behind a man the story spent years teaching its audience to underestimate before revealing, all at once, exactly how much had been quietly built for years in rooms nobody thought to watch closely enough. A hidden teacher, never named on screen, sits at the root of nearly everything this collection has gathered tonight. And now, having traced that route as far back as the primary story allows it to be traced, there is nowhere left to go but back out toward the surface, back toward rest, back toward the quiet, patient acceptance that has settled slowly over this entire long night, that some roots are simply meant to stay buried, holding up everything they support without ever once needing to be seen. A young mother living as a slave on a dry, sun-blasted world at the edge of civilized space tells a visiting stranger gently and without embellishment that her son has no father, that she carried him, raised him, and cannot explain his conception through any ordinary account of how children are conceived. The story offers this claim once, early, delivered with total sincerity by a woman the audience has no particular reason to distrust, and then moves on almost immediately to other concerns, treating the claim less as a mystery-demanding investigation than as a simple, accepted fact of the boy's unusual, gifted nature. A nature already visible by that point in his test results, his reflexes, his instinctive fluency with machinery, and, eventually, with the underlying energy field itself. The story's own internal explanation for unusual force sensitivity, offered around the same time, involves a measurable microscopic organism living symbiotically within every living cell, present in far greater concentration in individuals unusually attuned to the force than in ordinary people. This explanation, on its own, does very little to actually resolve the mystery of the boy's fatherless conception. A high concentration of these microscopic organisms might explain unusual sensitivity to the Force, but it does not by itself explain how a woman with no partner came to be pregnant in the first place, unless something else, some other mechanism entirely, deliberately intervened to make that pregnancy possible. It is here that the story, quietly, without ever confirming it directly on screen, gestures toward its most unsettling possible answer. A separate, unconnected piece of dialogue delivered years earlier in the story's internal chronology by an old cautious teacher recounting a legend about a Sith Lord who could influence the very building blocks of life itself, sits close enough to this boy's fatherless conception that generations of careful audiences have drawn the same quiet, unconfirmed conclusion that this legendary Sith Lord may have been responsible, deliberately or as an unintended side effect of some other, larger experiment, for the boy's conception, creating, whether on purpose or by accident, the very individual who would eventually grow up to become one half of the deadliest weapon the dark side had ever produced, decades before that weapon's dark master ever needed him. The story never confirms this. It never denies it either. What it offers instead, characteristically, is proximity, two pieces of information, placed close enough together across the run of a single trilogy that an attentive audience cannot help drawing a line between them, and yet never close enough, never explicit enough to count as an actual on-screen confirmation of anything at all. If true, the implications are almost dizzying in scope. A boy conceived not through any natural process, but through deliberate ancient manipulation of the underlying energy field of the galaxy itself, raised in poverty and slavery with no knowledge of his own artificial origin, eventually manipulated by an entirely different Dark Master into becoming the very instrument of destruction his unconfirmed original creator may have hoped, quietly, to one day command instead. There is something worth sitting with in the specific, patient cruelty of that possibility, if it is true. A life engineered from its very first cell for a purpose its subject never chose and never even knew existed, manipulated at every subsequent stage by people who understood exactly what he was capable of long before he understood it himself. And there is something worth sitting with too in the story's total refusal to confirm or deny any of it. A refusal that by now, this deep into a long night spent tracing exactly this pattern across dozens of other open doors, no longer feels like an accident so much as a signature, the particular fingerprint of a saga that has always preferred implication to confirmation, atmosphere to mechanism, the quiet, unsettled feeling of almost knowing to the flatter, more final feeling of actually being told. A slow, quiet image belongs here before this chapter closes. A small, sun-bleached room on a desert world, a young mother sitting beside a sleeping child whose conception she can neither explain nor fully understand, wind moving low and constant outside thin walls, twin suns beginning their long, slow descent toward the horizon in the exact way they always eventually do on that particular world, indifferent to whatever ancient, unconfirmed manipulation may or may not have brought that particular child into being inside that particular small, quiet room. It was not a mystery the story ever intended to fully solve. It was, instead, one more careful, deliberate proximity, two facts placed close enough together to haunt an attentive mind for decades, and never once close enough to close the door they were so carefully built to leave open. A single boy's uncertain, possibly engineered origin is one deeply personal, unresolved question. A much larger, much colder one belongs to an entire army of identical soldiers, each one carrying, buried somewhere inside his own skull, a piece of technology designed for exactly one purpose: to override his own free will, on command, at the precise moment his masters needed him most. An entire army, cloned from a single genetic template, trained from artificially accelerated childhood for a war they had no say in choosing, fought loyally for years alongside Jedi commanders many of them came to trust, respect, and in some quiet, private way, even love. And then, in a single coordinated moment, spread across dozens of worlds simultaneously, that same loyal army turned on those same commanders without hesitation, gunning down officers they had served beside for years, following a single coded order with a speed and a totality that no ordinary act of betrayal could ever fully explain. The story's eventual explanation, offered years after the event itself was first shown on screen, involves a small, implanted piece of technology placed inside every clone trooper's brain, apparently without the knowledge or consent of the men carrying it, designed specifically to override their own free will and personal loyalty the moment a specific coded command was given. This explanation resolves the most basic tactical question: how mechanically did total betrayal happen so quickly, so uniformly, across so many separate battlefields at once, while leaving almost every deeper question about the device itself entirely unaddressed? Who designed this technology? When was it actually implanted? And by whom, given that the clones themselves appear to have had no memory or awareness of the procedure? How long had this contingency been planned, given that its scale and coordination suggest years of careful preparation rather than a single, sudden decision made near the end of a long war? And perhaps most troublingly of all, how many of the men who followed that order ever fully understood afterward, in whatever time remained to them, exactly what had been done to their own minds without their knowledge or their consent? The story offers, across its own supplementary corners, occasional glimpses of individual clones capable of resisting or removing this implanted device, suggesting that whatever technology it represents is not absolute, not beyond the reach of will or intervention, given the right knowledge and the right timing. But the primary account of how, when, and by whom this technology was actually developed and installed across an entire army numbering in the millions remains almost entirely unexplored on screen, treated instead the way this entire collection has learned to expect nearly every large, uncomfortable mechanism in this galaxy to be treated, acknowledged just enough to explain the plot, and then left conspicuously, deliberately under-examined once the plot no longer requires it. There is a particular kind of grief embedded in this mystery that distinguishes it from nearly everything else gathered across this long night, because unlike most of the other unanswered doors this collection has walked past, this one is not really about wonder or scale or ancient legend. It is about consent, about identity, about the specific, quiet horror of discovering, too late for it to matter, that a lifetime of loyalty and camaraderie could be erased in an instant by a piece of technology its own carriers never knew was there, installed by people they trusted for a purpose they were never told, activated the moment it became convenient for those same people to activate it. There is a slow, somber image worth resting in here rather than rushing past, quieter and heavier than most of what this collection has offered so far. Rows of identical white armor, resting now in the dust of a battlefield long since gone quiet, helmets removed, faces beneath them varied and individual despite a lifetime spent being treated as interchangeable. Each one carrying, somewhere behind his own eyes, the small, cold, unexamined fact of a device he never knew was there and never consented to carrying, doing exactly what it was built to do at exactly the moment someone else, far away, decided it was time. It was not simply a plot mechanism, however useful it proved to the story that needed it. It was, and remains, one of the quietest and most uncomfortable unanswered doors this whole collection has gathered tonight. Not because the story never explained how the device worked, but because it never fully sat with what the device's mere existence actually meant about the men who carried it, and the people who chose, in total secrecy, to put it there. Decades after the first great archive of Jedi knowledge was shown briefly to contain at least one deliberate undetected gap, the erased planet, the missing record, the quiet demonstration that even the most trusted library in the galaxy could be wrong without knowing it, a second library met a far more direct and far more total fate. A lone teacher, having gathered a handful of ancient sacred texts salvaged from the fall of the old order, built a new temple, a new school, a modest attempt at rebuilding something the galaxy had lost, and stored those same ancient texts, along with whatever new records his own small group of students had begun to accumulate, inside its walls. And one night, in a single moment of doubt, fear, and catastrophic misjudgment, that same teacher very nearly killed one of his own students in his sleep, and in the chaos that followed, the temple burned, and with it, by every indication the story offers, went whatever remained of the ancient texts he had spent years trying to preserve. The story treats this loss almost entirely as emotional wreckage rather than informational catastrophe, understandably given the personal stakes of the scene: a teacher's failure, a student's turn toward darkness, a friendship, and a family fractured in a single night. But sitting quietly underneath that emotional wreckage is a colder, more practical loss this collection has learned, by now, to notice wherever it appears. Whatever knowledge those ancient texts actually contained, knowledge that had by that point already survived the fall of an empire, the collapse of an order, decades of hiding and scattering and careful preservation, appears, by every indication the story offers, to have been destroyed again, this time completely, in a single night, by the very teacher who had spent so much effort trying to keep it safe. A brief scene, much later, revives a version of this thread just long enough to complicate rather than resolve it. A wooden chest, recovered quietly from the wreckage of that same temple by the very teacher's own sister, containing at least some of the original sacred texts, apparently saved after all, apparently smuggled away before the fire could finish its work, and passed on, eventually, to a new student, beginning her own uncertain journey toward becoming whatever kind of Jedi the galaxy might still need. This recovery answers the most basic surviving question. No, the knowledge was not entirely lost. While raising a handful of smaller, quieter ones, the story never circles back to address directly how much of the original archive was actually saved as opposed to lost. Who else might have known these texts survived? And why did the story wait so long, across so many intervening years of both narrative time and real-world release schedules, before finally confirming their survival at all? And whether the version finally passed down to a new generation is complete or partial or subtly altered by whatever damage or loss occurred during the chaos of that single terrible night. There is something almost gently ironic in the fact that this collection, having spent so much of its long length examining a first archive's hidden, undetected gaps, arrives eventually at a second archive whose gaps are the opposite kind entirely. Not hidden and undetected, but violently, visibly total and then quietly only partially reversed, offering just enough hope to suggest survival without ever confirming the full, honest scope of what was actually lost. Knowledge in this galaxy, across every single example this whole night has gathered, seems to exist in a permanent, uneasy state between preservation and destruction, between the confident, comfortable assumption that history has been safely recorded and the far more unsettling truth that record-keeping, in this particular mythology, has never once been shown to be fully reliable, vulnerable to sabotage in one era, vulnerable to fire and grief and a single terrible misjudgment in another, and never, across the entire span of this saga's storytelling, finally fully secure. There is a slow, quiet image worth resting in before this chapter, and the whole long collection built around chapters exactly like it finally comes to its rest. A wooden chest, its corners scorched but its contents intact, sitting for years in the quiet dark of a modest freighter's storage hold, waiting patiently, the way so much of this galaxy's oldest and most valuable knowledge seems, again and again, content to wait. Not lost, not quite found either, simply present, simply persisting, somewhere just out of frame until someone with the patience and the need to look eventually opens the lid and finds out, at long last, exactly how much of the old world actually survived the night it was supposed to have ended for good. It was not a story that forgot to explain what happened to its own oldest knowledge. It was a story that let that knowledge nearly die, twice, in two different ways, in two different eras, and then let it survive, quietly, imperfectly, exactly enough to keep going, exactly enough to remain like nearly everything else gathered across this entire night, patiently, permanently unfinished. And that, in the end, may be the softest and most honest way to describe every single door this long night has gathered and gently set back down without ever fully closing. Not lost, not quite found either. Simply present, simply persisting, waiting patiently, the way this whole galaxy always seems to wait for whoever comes next with the patience to keep asking, gently, unhurriedly, one more quiet question before finally, at long last, letting the rest of it go. On a green, forested world, largely untouched by the wider galaxy's wars, a strange, ancient creature lived alone for what the story implies was an extraordinarily long span of time, describing himself, when finally pressed, not as good or evil, not as light or dark, but simply as the one in the middle, a being who claimed to have watched both a Jedi and a Sith pass through his forest in earlier eras, offering each of them counsel without ever fully aligning himself with either. He speaks, when he speaks at all, in slow, deliberate riddles, more interested in balance for its own sake than in victory for either side of the galaxy's oldest conflict, and the story that introduces him, again, tellingly, a piece of animated storytelling rather than one of the numbered films, never once explains what he actually is. Not a Jedi, not a Sith, not quite an embodiment of the Force in the same literal physical sense as the ancient family glimpsed once on that other strange, isolated world. And yet clearly, unmistakably, something far older and far more attuned to the underlying energy of the galaxy than any ordinary living creature the wider saga otherwise bothers to introduce. He is given, eventually, a fate of his own within that same animated story, consumed in a moment of his own choosing by a monstrous, corrupting force he had spent his long, patient life trying to contain, sacrificing himself in a manner the story frames as necessary rather than tragic. A being who had already lived so long outside the ordinary rules of light and dark that even his own ending refused to fit neatly into either category. And having offered this much, a creature old enough to remember eras the wider saga barely gestures at, self-aware enough to reject both major traditions built around the same energy he embodied more purely than either one, and in the end, willing to disappear entirely rather than let the balance he protected collapse. The story simply lets him go, unexplained beyond his own riddling self-description, never referenced again with any real weight by any other corner of this vast, sprawling mythology. There is something fitting, this deep into so long a night, in ending on a figure who explicitly, deliberately refused to be sorted into either of the two categories nearly every other mystery gathered across this whole collection has circled again and again. Light and dark, Jedi and Sith, dismissed and vindicated. He offers instead a third possibility this collection has only touched glancingly until now, the possibility that some things in this galaxy were never meant to resolve into any side at all, were never meant to be claimed by any tradition, were content instead to simply exist in the quiet, patient middle, watching both sides pass through, offering what wisdom they were willing to accept and asking in return for nothing at all beyond being left, mostly, alone. There is a final, slow, settled image worth resting in here, gentler than almost anything else gathered across this whole long collection. A quiet forest floor at dusk, moss thick and soft underfoot, a low mist rising slowly between ancient moss-covered trunks, and somewhere just beyond the edge of clear sight, a shape neither wholly seen nor wholly hidden, watching, patient, unbothered by whichever side of the galaxy's oldest argument happens to be passing through his forest this particular evening. He does not need to be understood to be real. He does not need to be sorted into light or dark to matter. He simply is, the way so much of what this long night has gathered simply is, old, quiet, patient, content to remain exactly as unexplained as he has always, gently, needed to be. It was not a mystery built to be solved. It was, more than almost anything else gathered across this entire collection, a mystery built to be a reminder that not every question in this galaxy is waiting for an answer at all. Some are simply waiting patiently in the quiet middle for someone tired enough and quiet enough and finally willing enough to stop asking and simply rest there instead. Scattered across this saga's longer, wider storytelling, mentioned in passing, glimpsed briefly in the backgrounds of scenes more concerned with other things, are small, dark, pyramidal containers the story calls holocrons built by both Jedi and Sith across centuries, each one holding recorded knowledge meant to be accessed only by someone attuned enough to the correct side of the Force, sealed against anyone lacking the proper discipline or intention to open them safely. Some are shown briefly, opened for a scene or two, offering a fragment of teaching or history before the story moves on to other business. Most are only ever mentioned, catalogued in passing as part of some larger archive, their actual contents never shown, never summarized, never accounted for once the scene that introduced them has ended. The uncomfortable arithmetic underneath this detail is simple enough to state plainly, even if the story itself never states it. If both major traditions have spent centuries recording their knowledge into small, portable, deliberately hidden containers, and if those containers have been scattered, lost, stolen, and rediscovered across a galaxy this large for this long, then an enormous amount of this galaxy's most significant knowledge is very likely sitting right now somewhere the story has simply never bothered to look, in the wreckage of a fallen temple, in the private vault of a wealthy collector who has no idea what he actually owns, in the sealed cargo hold of a ship that went missing decades ago and was never recovered. The story confirms this possibility exists. It has shown at least a handful of examples changing hands across various corners of its wider storytelling, and it has never once attempted anything resembling a full account of how many such containers might still be out there, holding what, waiting for whom. There is a particular quiet comfort in this specific mystery that distinguishes it gently from some of the heavier ones gathered earlier in this long night. Unlike the ancient civilization erased by time, or the teacher who trained an empire's architect in total secrecy, this one carries no real dread underneath it. only the soft, patient possibility that somewhere out there in this same old, well-worn galaxy there is still more to find. Not urgently, not dangerously, simply patiently, the way this entire collection has learned, chapter after chapter, to hold nearly everything it has gathered, as an open door rather than a closed one, a box not yet opened rather than a box deliberately, permanently sealed. Picture gently, one final time before this whole long night finally rests, a small, dark, dust-covered shape sitting quietly on a high shelf in some forgotten corner of a forgotten world, unopened for longer than anyone currently living has any memory of, waiting without any particular urgency for someone, eventually, to notice it, to reach for it, to finally, gently find out what it was always patiently holding. It was not a mystery meant to be solved tonight. It was, like nearly every other door this long, slow collection has gathered, quietly, carefully, and set back down without forcing all the way open, simply one more small, patient box, left exactly where it has always been, waiting for whoever comes looking next. Long before any of the names most familiar to this saga's audience were spoken on screen, a different story was told quietly inside a single animated series about a strange, ancient world where the underlying energy field of the galaxy did not merely flow through living things the way it does everywhere else, but appeared to take on shape, personality, and will of its own, embodied in three separate figures bound together as something like a family. One held the light, one held the dark, and between them stood a third, the balance, the mediator, holding both in careful, exhausting tension, keeping an entire world and, by strong implication, the entire wider galaxy connected to it through channels the story never fully explains, from tipping permanently toward either extreme. The visiting characters who stumble onto this world, themselves major, central figures in the wider saga, are given only fragments of context for what they are witnessing, a prophecy involving one of them specifically, treated as either confirmation or contradiction of destinies already discussed elsewhere in the broader story. A series of temptations and tests that seem designed less to explain the nature of this strange family than to use the visitors as instruments in a private, ancient conflict that predates their arrival by an unknowable span of time, and eventually a tragedy, quiet and total, that leaves the careful three-part balance of that world broken, its embodiments no longer three but reduced, the mediating figure gone, the remaining two left in some worse, less stable configuration. The story never returns to check on again. And then, having shown this much, enough to suggest that the underlying energy field of the entire galaxy might, in this one place, have taken on a form close enough to literal deities to be bargained with, tempted, and lost, the story simply closes that door and never opens it again. No other story set anywhere else in this vast, sprawling saga ever references this place by name again with any real weight. No explanation is offered for why this one world, of all the worlds the story visits across decades of storytelling, was apparently allowed to host something this literal, this embodied, this close to religious cosmology made physical, while everywhere else the same underlying energy field remains diffuse, ambient, ungoverned by anything as concrete as a family of three. The reframe worth sitting with here, gently, is not that this thread was forgotten by accident. Very little in this particular franchise, across this many decades and this many storytellers, is ever forgotten entirely by accident. Threads are far more often folded quietly back under the surface, left available for later use, and simply never picked back up because no later story ever found the specific, careful use for them that would have justified the risk of returning. A world where the Force takes physical, personal form is either the most important location in the entire mythology, offering a literal window into the actual mechanism underneath everything else this saga does, or it is a single self-contained fable, meaningful only on its own terms, never meant to bear the weight of explaining anything beyond itself. The story has never chosen between these two readings, and by declining to choose, it has left both permanently, quietly available, which is by now a familiar shape indeed. The same shape as nearly every other unanswered door this whole collection has spent its length walking past, admiring, and leaving standing. There is a slow image worth resting inside here, gentler than almost any offered so far, precisely because so little about it was ever explained with any urgency. A single ancient tree at the center of a quiet, sunlit clearing, its bark pale and smooth, its branches heavy with a stillness that feels less like silence and more like patience, the kind of patience that only belongs to something that has already watched several lifetimes pass without needing to hurry through any of them. Whatever that tree actually was, a monument, a wound, a doorway of its own kind, quietly related to the other strange doorway glimpsed once, briefly, in a temple ruin many years later in the story's internal chronology. And the story never says, and by this point in the night, it hardly needs to. Some trees are simply allowed to stand, unexplained, holding their small, private mystery close, the way this entire galaxy has, again and again, allowed its oldest and strangest places to hold theirs. It was not a forgotten thread exactly, and it was not a fully intentional one either. It was, more precisely, a door built once, carefully, and then left standing on purpose, in the specific, deliberate way this whole saga seems to have learned, gradually, across decades of its own unfolding, that not every room needs to be connected to every hallway for the house as a whole to still feel whole. A family of three, embodying the Force itself on a single hidden world, is one kind of ancient cosmic unanswered question. A much smaller, much more recent one, two friends, and the enormous, ancient creatures that carried them, vanishing together into the deep, unmapped dark between galaxies, with no confirmed account yet given of where that journey actually led them, carries a very different, gentler kind of unfinished weight, closer in scale to the island at the edge of the sea than to anything as vast as three literal embodiments of an entire galaxy's underlying energy. Near the end of one particular chapter of this galaxy's animated storytelling, two friends, one of them a young man who had spent years fighting a losing, patient war against an empire that eventually cornered him with an overwhelming, seemingly final trap, the other an old adversary turned uneasy ally, brought together by circumstance rather than by any real trust between them, find themselves facing near certain destruction, cornered on a burning battlefield with no remaining path forward through conventional means. And then, at the very last possible moment, a pod of enormous, ancient, starfaring creatures themselves barely glimpsed or explained anywhere else across the wider saga, arrive and carry both of them away, not simply out of danger, but out of the galaxy itself entirely, vanishing together into a stretch of unmapped, unexplained space the story has never, in any format since, fully returned to chart. The years that followed, inside the story's internal chronology, offered only fragments. A mother's quiet, unshaken conviction that her son was still alive somewhere, sustained by little more than a feeling and a single number scrawled and treasured as a private code between them. Occasional second-hand rumors gathered by other characters in other corners of the wider saga, suggesting a growing search effort mounted specifically to locate wherever those two men and their strange, ancient carriers had actually gone. And eventually confirmation, offered gently, that the search itself had become a central driving motivation for at least one other major character's entire subsequent arc, without the actual destination or the actual fate of the two missing men ever being fully resolved on screen within the time frame the wider saga has covered so far. This is, in its way, one of the more recent and more actively developing doors this whole collection has gathered tonight, and it carries a slightly different texture than most of the others precisely because of that recency. It is not an old mystery worn smooth by decades of accumulated fan theory and supplementary material the way the Swamp Cave or the sacred texts have become. It is a newer door, still slightly ajar rather than fully closed, still actively being circled by ongoing storytelling that has not yet decided, or at least has not yet revealed, exactly how much of this particular mystery it intends to eventually resolve, and how much it intends to leave standing, unopened, the way this galaxy has so consistently chosen to leave so many of its oldest and largest doors standing before it. The dismissive judgment offered, quietly, by more cynical or exhausted characters within the story follows the same shape this collection keeps returning to, chapter after chapter. That the search is likely hopeless, that whatever carried the two missing men away likely carried them somewhere no rescue could ever meaningfully follow, that the mother's quiet faith is, however understandable, probably a comfort rather than an accurate prediction. Whether that judgment will eventually be proven as wrong as nearly every other dismissive judgment gathered across this entire collection remains, as of this telling, genuinely, actively unknown. Not unknown in the deliberate, patient, decades-old way of the swamp cave, but unknown in the newer, more immediate way of a door that has only just begun to be built, its final shape still being decided somewhere further down the road than this particular collection has been able to follow it yet. There is a soft, particular comfort in a mystery still young enough to be genuinely open rather than merely unresolved, and it is worth resting in that difference for a moment before this whole long night finally gently comes to a close. Picture a small, quiet room, somewhere on a green, forested world, a single, treasured token kept close by someone who has never once stopped believing, against every reasonable expectation, that the person she loves is still out there, somewhere, beyond the edge of every chart anyone has yet managed to draw. That image does not require an answer to feel complete. It requires only the specific, gentle patience of someone willing to keep a door open for as long as it takes, however long that turns out to be. It was not resolved, and unlike nearly everything else gathered across this long collection, it may not even be finished being written yet, which is, in its own quiet way, the gentlest kind of open door this whole night has offered. Not a mystery grown old and comfortable in its unresolved state, but one still young enough to be worth staying awake just a little longer, to wonder about, before finally, at last, letting the whole of it go. Every single mystery gathered across this long, unhurried collection has worn by now into the exact same shape, smoothed the way stone steps are smoothed by centuries of unremembered feet passing quietly over them again and again without ever fully wearing the stone away. A dismissal offered early and confidently by someone who should have known better. A silence maintained faithfully for years, sometimes for decades, that never quite hardens into confirmation and never quite hardens into denial either. The cave in the swamp was never explained, the archive was never fully audited, the master who cheated death was never confirmed or fully unmasked, the sacred texts were never verified. The scarred face was given a mechanism without ever being given a meaning. The moon-sized weapons were built and destroyed and never fully accounted for. The bounty hunter fell and 30 years later quietly climbed back out. The island held its silence at the edge of the sea. The girl was told she was nobody, and then she was told she was somebody, and the story never fully chose between the two, and, in the end, chose to let her choose instead. The old civilization was gestured at briefly and left mostly in the dark, where it still, patiently, waits. The doorway between moments was glimpsed once, and closed again, gently, on purpose. The small green mystery was raised twice more across 2 more generations, and never once was given a name. The mask came off at the very end, and what was underneath it was allowed to matter, quietly, without ever being fully earned or fully denied. The rule that governed 1,000 years of hidden betrayal was never shown solving the very problem it claimed the whole time to have solved. The hidden world stayed hidden, mechanically unexplained, right up until the precise moment it finally, unmistakably, stopped being hidden at all. A family of 3, embodying the deepest energy of the whole galaxy, appeared once on one quiet world and was never spoken of again with the same weight, and 2 friends sailed into the dark between galaxies, carried by creatures older than most of this saga's recorded history and have not yet, as of tonight, been found. A witch struck down mid-ritual was never confirmed as truly, finally gone. A dying ruler's contingency for total ruin was stopped, at cost, before its full shape could ever be fully measured. The oldest tombs on the driest, windiest world stood older than the rule that claimed to descend cleanly from them. A small crystal, capable of quiet preference and quiet suffering both, was never explained beyond the fact of its choosing. A teacher who trained an empire's architect in a dim room somewhere behind everything else this whole night gathered was never given a name or a face. A boy conceived without a father grew up to become half of the deadliest weapon the dark side ever built, and no one ever confirmed exactly who or what first made that conception possible. An entire army carried, without their knowledge or their consent, a piece of technology built for exactly the moment it was finally used against them. A library burned once and burned again, and somehow, quietly, imperfectly, kept surviving anyway. And somewhere in a quiet green forest, a being who refused to belong to either side of this galaxy's oldest argument simply watched and waited and eventually chose to disappear entirely rather than let anyone finish the argument on his behalf. Underneath every one of these, patient and quiet and older than any single mystery built on top of it, sits the same soft, unanswered question this whole night has been slowly circling from its very first sentence onward. What actually is the force that binds all of this together, and why has this galaxy chosen, again and again across nearly 50 years of its own unfolding, to describe that force's effects in loving, exhaustive detail, while leaving its actual nature so gently, so consistently unexplained? It was never really about withheld information at all, not underneath, not really. It was about a very old, very patient understanding, present from the very first unexplained frame of the very first film, that a galaxy explained completely stops quite quickly being a galaxy at all, and starts instead to feel like a diagram, flat, finished, fully lit, with nowhere left for a tired mind, late at night, to quietly wander. So let the doors stay closed a little longer tonight. Let the cave keep its secret, and the archive keep its gaps, and the island keep its silence, and the small green figure keep his unnamed home, and the two friends keep sailing, somewhere out past the edge of every chart anyone has yet managed to draw, toward a shore nobody has confirmed exists. Let the energy field that holds this whole galaxy together keep the one quality it has always, patiently, protected above every other quality it might have been given instead, the simple, durable, oddly comforting fact of not yet being fully known. There is a kind of rest in that, a deeper rest in the end than any single answer could ever quite provide. The rest of a mystery finally, gently, given permission to stay exactly as unfinished as it has always, quietly, needed to be. Next time, there is another door waiting, somewhere else in this same old galaxy. Another dismissal waiting patiently to be gently, slowly disproven. Another shape in the dark that history once decided, wrongly, did not need a name. There will always be another cave nobody explained, another archive with a gap nobody caught in time, another quiet island holding a silence nobody has fully earned the right to interrupt. That is simply what a galaxy this old, this wide, this patiently unfinished is always going to keep offering to anyone willing to stay a little longer and listen a little closer than the story, strictly speaking, ever required. For tonight, though, this is enough. Every mystery gathered across this long, slow collection has been carried gently, set down carefully, and left exactly as open as it was found. Not out of neglect and not out of any failure to look closely enough, but out of the same old patient understanding that opened this whole night in the first place. That some doors are more valuable for having been found at all than for anything a final answer could ever add to them. The cave is still dark. The archive still has its gaps. The island still keeps its silence at the edge of a grey and endless sea. The small green figure is still somewhere nameless and at peace. And somewhere out past every chart anyone has ever managed to draw, two friends are still sailing slowly, patiently, toward a shore that may or may not exist, carried by creatures older than almost anything else this galaxy has ever shown. The doors are still standing, nobody needs to open them yet. Rest now.